Since its first outing way back in 1987, the Final Fantasy franchise has flourished in numerous ways. There is of course the associated sales, with Square Enix announcing earlier this year that the franchise had sold over 130 million copies worldwide, but there's also just the sheer expansion of the franchise. We've now had 15 main numbered titles within the franchise, but there are now sequels, spin-offs, sequels to the spin-offs, animes, books, and even feature films. Needless to say, to pull this all off, there needs to be a lot of creative talent involved, but I think it's safe to say that some of the guys who have been pretty instrumental in making this happen don't always get the credit that they're due. I think we're all familiar with creators like Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yoshinori Kitase, Hajime Tabata, and Motomo Toriyama, and that makes sense. They were either founding fathers of the franchise, have directed the most critically acclaimed games in the series, or ushered in change in perhaps contentious ways. But for each of these prominent directors that are more household names, there are plenty more who have worked on pretty big games in the franchise but didn't quite get the same recognition. In this video, we therefore want to shine the spotlight on some of the individuals who have directed or are even currently directing Final Fantasy games that you've probably never heard of. But before I get on to the good stuff though, be sure to subscribe to Final Fantasy Union for more videos like this one, and hit that notification button to make sure you instantly get alerted when we publish new content. Alright, so first on the list is Koichi Ishii, someone who I hold in very high regard. His journey with the franchise started right at the beginning, and I'd argue that he's someone who's right up there with some of the most influential figures within the Final Fantasy franchise, but also video games in general. In fact, many of his decisions were so integral to the franchise that they're even still with us today, you just probably aren't aware of it. Ishii joined Square back in 1987 and worked on Final Fantasy 1, 2 and 3, but his roles differed on each of the projects. On the original game, he provided battle graphics and acted as a planner, which basically meant he did a ton of other tasks such as general game design, level design and project management. On Final Fantasy 2, he took a more active role, specifically working as a game designer, and it was during this project that he created two of the most recognizable Final Fantasy characters of all time, the Chocobo and the Moogle. Now, we wouldn't actually see the Moogle appear until Final Fantasy 3, where Ishii worked as an object designer, but both are still credited as his creations. Ishii was also then the brainchild behind the first Final Fantasy spin-off, Final Fantasy Adventure, which appeared on the Game Boy in 1991 and would act as the first game in the Mana series. He acted as the game's director, but also the game's principal artist. He also wrote the scenario alongside one Yoshinori Kitase, who was just getting started at Square. Around this time, Ishii was also one of the main creative minds behind the Final Fantasy Legend, the first game in what would become the Saga franchise. In the years that followed, Ishii would then direct Secret of Mana and Legend of Mana, while also actively contributing to Seiken Densetsu 3 and Saga Frontier, but everything I've mentioned would seem minor in comparison to his next project, Final Fantasy XI. Now, I've no idea how it was decided that Ishii would direct Final Fantasy XI, but he stepped up to the plate nonetheless and was responsible for trying to create a compelling world. But how he did this may surprise you. He wanted to create a punishing world where great things could only be accomplished by cooperation and teamwork. It's why he created things like skill chains, but he also had a significant hand in creating the EXP system and also the game's economy. Against these systems, he noted that he wanted the game's economy to make the player feel insignificant in isolation, but understanding of the importance of community. With the EXP system, which famously penalised you for dying, he said that he did this to help encourage empathy amongst fellow players. So to summarise, Ishii created the Moogle and the Chocobo, he created the Mana franchise, and was also a prominent figure in creating the Saga franchise. He also directed Final Fantasy XI and its first expansion, Rise of Zealot, laying the foundations for it to become Square Enix's most profitable game of all time. Now, after stepping away from the director's chair on Final Fantasy XI back in 2003, he then went on to direct Dawn of Mana and supervised numerous projects before leaving to create his own studio called Grezzo. They worked on The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D, Majora's Mask 3D, Four Swords Anniversary Edition, and Triforce Heroes, all before starting work on their own brand new IP called Ever Oasis, which launched earlier this year on the Nintendo 3DS. Next on the list is Kazuhiko Aoki, who created one of the most memorable games within the Final Fantasy franchise, at least from my perspective. And from that hint, anyone who knows me may already have some idea as to which game he directed, but we'll get onto that in a second. Aoki actually joined Square in 1984 at the same time as Hironobu Sakaguchi and Hiromichi Tanaka. During this time, he created the scenario for a game called King's Knight, which you may recognise because it was rebooted as one of the glorious Final Fantasy XV spin-off mobile titles recently. He then worked on creating Hanjaku Hero and was brought into the Final Fantasy team following a restructure at Square. This saw him working as a game designer on Final Fantasy III and a battle designer on Final Fantasy IV, where he worked on the ATB system that had been created by Hiroki Ito. As a fun fact here, it's said that during this time Aoki smoked so much that he created a cloud so thick it caused hard drives to break during the development of Final Fantasy III. Now after Final Fantasy IV, he stepped away from the Final Fantasy franchise to direct another Hanjaku Hero game before working as the producer on arguably the best RPG of all time, Chrono Trigger. From here, Aoki directed the Toes-developed PlayStation port of Final Fantasy IV. He then worked as an event designer on both Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX, and also directed Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon and its sequel. But it's what he did next that has cemented him as a legend within the franchise, at least in my eyes, as he served as the director of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. It was the first Final Fantasy game to be released on a Nintendo system since Final Fantasy VI, which meant it came with incredible expectation. And to help with this, they made it very innovative. Not only did it incorporate real-time combat, it was also the first RPG to make use of the GameCube Game Boy Advance Link functionality. And even in that regard, it was also much more extreme than any other game using this connectivity, as all 4 players had to use a Game Boy Advance to play the game in multiplayer. Now, I'll admit, the Crystal Chronicles as a single-player experience is not the best game ever made, but if you were lucky enough to have 4 local friends who each had a Game Boy Advance and a link cable, then you were in for one of the best Final Fantasy experiences around. Following his work on the original Crystal Chronicles, he then stepped away from the franchise and worked as a supervisor on the DS remake of Final Fantasy III alongside Koichi Ishii. And after this, he then moved over to the Dragon Quest team to work as a World Planner Chief on Dragon Quest X. The next person on our list is Hiroki Chiba, a director within the Final Fantasy franchise who, despite being perhaps the most recognisable creator on this list, still doesn't get enough recognition for what he's brought to the table, at least in my opinion. He joined Square way back in 1993, and his first credit was as an event planner on Chrono Trigger. The next year, he was actually given a chance to step into the director's chair with a Japanese exclusive niche title called Dynamy Tracer. But it wouldn't be until the year after that he would start to make a mark on the Final Fantasy franchise. First, he worked as an event planner on Final Fantasy VII before being promoted to event director on Final Fantasy VIII. In the same year, Chiba also worked as an event planner on Chrono Cross before rejoining Yoshinori Kitase and Kazuhiko Najima to work as an event planner on Final Fantasy X. Chiba's next role saw him promoted to a more active role within the Scenario division, as he served as the Scenario and Event Planning Director on Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII, and this would see him enter into a new line of work within the company. 2 years later, he directed Sigma Harmonics, a brand new IP that unfortunately also didn't get released outside of Japan, and he then joined Hajime Tabata's team to craft the scenario for Final Fantasy Type 0 as the lead scenario writer. He wasn't done there though, as he was also brought into the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy as a scenario writer on Lightning Returns. It meant Chiba had walked a long path before finally being given the opportunity to direct a game in the Final Fantasy franchise, which after being conceived by Chiba and Shinji Hashimoto would become World of Final Fantasy. For this project, Chiba would not only direct, but he would also write the scenario. However, unlike his previous works, which focused on stories with darker tones, World of Final Fantasy would be geared towards a much younger audience. He also wanted to make sure it touched on nostalgia, so he focused on elements that were seen in the franchise before Final Fantasy X. Who knows what Chiba will be working on next, but I'm hoping he either gets a second bite of the Final Fantasy directorial cherry, or he gets to work on a dark adult scenario for a new main numbered Final Fantasy game. Fourth on our list is Takeo Kujiroka, someone who, compared to the previous names on the list, doesn't quite have the same glittering credits. However, he's still been at Square Enix for over a decade, working primarily on battle systems. This has seen him work as a battle planner and battle designer across the entire Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, but he also worked as a battle planner on the original Dissidia before being promoted to battle planning director on Dissidia Duodecim. It therefore shouldn't be too surprising to learn that Koji Hiroki is now serving as the director on both Dissidia Final Fantasy Arcade, but also Dissidia Final Fantasy NT. Even though he has been present at E3 and other major trade shows, a lot of communications around the game actually come from Ichiro Hizama, the producer on Dissidia NT and also the head of Business Division 4, and it's why, despite the game being the only Final Fantasy product on the horizon right now, might explain why Koji Hiroki's profile is perhaps not as high as some of the other Final Fantasy personalities you're familiar with. Who knows, after Dissidia NT's release, he may become more vocal, but we'll have to wait and see. The next director on our list, Hiroshi Minagawa, played a very important part in moving the Final Fantasy franchise in a whole new direction, while also contributing heavily to perhaps the largest supporting universe that exists, Ivalice. Minagawa worked alongside Yasumi Matsuno and Akihiko Yoshida at Quest before they left to join Square in 1995. Their first game together was Final Fantasy Tactics, and Minagawa was in charge of art direction. He later reprised this role for their follow-up Ivalice title, Vagrant Story. After small stints helping out on Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, Minagawa's next project was again alongside Matsuno and Yoshida on Final Fantasy XII, where he was assigned the role of graphics and real-time visual director. However, as I think everyone knows, the project suffered complications due to Matsuno's ill health, and he subsequently left the company. Minagawa then stepped up to fill the void and assumed all of Matsuno's directorial duties alongside Hiroyuki Ito. So whenever we talk about Final Fantasy XII, while we should talk about the achievements of Matsuno and Ito, we should also talk about the achievements of Minagawa. In his own words, one of the most enjoyable parts of this transition was that many of the teams came up with great ideas for how they could keep improving the game, but the flip side was that he then had to make difficult decisions around what they needed to focus on in order to get the game shipped. This included new scenario content from Yun Akiyama and Daisuke Watanabe, but also gameplay features. In an interview after launch, which was included in the special edition DVD, he noted that had he been able to proceed with all of the ideas his team came up with, he's sure the game could have been even better than the one we got. After directing Final Fantasy XII, Minagawa moved over to work on Square Enix's Crystal Tools engine, which was used for the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy and also the original version of Final Fantasy XIV. He then returned to the Ivalice franchise to direct the Tactics Ogre remake on the PlayStation Portable before joining Naoki Yoshida's team to work on the Final Fantasy XIV revival. Within Yoshida's team, he served as the lead UI designer on The Realm Reborn and also Heavensward before becoming art director on Stormblood. Last on our list, but definitely not least, is Kenichi Tschida, a director who is starting to find his feet within Hajime Tabata's Business Division 2. I'm not too sure when Tschida joined Square Enix, but he's one of the newest staff members on this list, that's for certain, as his first credit was on Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, where he was part of the animation staff. He was then promoted to be one of the lead designers on Kingdom Hearts 2, and he fulfilled the same role on Re-Chain of Memories, but also Kingdom Hearts HD 1.5 Remix. It was after all of this that he joined Hajime Tabata's team to work on Final Fantasy XV, and he served as one of the development managers alongside Yasuaki Nasu and Yasunobu Ito. However, after the launch of Final Fantasy XV, Tschida was promoted to a role that not many people are aware of, the director of scenario DLC for the game. Despite Tabata still being the face of Final Fantasy XV in the West, he has actually stepped away from taking such an active role with Final Fantasy XV's DLC, and delegated directorial duties of the first 2 scenario episodes to Kenichi Tschida, with Kazuya Takahashi looking after comrades. The director of episode Ignis is still unknown, but it may well be Tschida again. Now, despite episode Gladiators not being all that well received, Tschida redeemed himself with the release of episode Prompto, as there was a much stronger focus on the narrative. He is hoping that Hajime Tabata recognises his talent even more and allows him to branch off on his own by perhaps directing a smaller project within Business Division 2. To me, it sounds like Tschida would be the perfect person to direct, I don't know, maybe the next game in the Final Fantasy type franchise? What do you guys think? So there you have it, guys, 6 Final Fantasy directors that I'm guessing you probably haven't ever heard of before. Which of them would you be most interested in seeing more from in the future? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, if you'd like to support us further because you really enjoy what we do, please consider backing us on Patreon. You can find out more information at patreon.com/FFUnion. These guys you're seeing now have already chosen to support us, and it's so humbling that this number keeps on continuing to grow. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you soon for more Final Fantasy videos.